So, Michael, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule and your travels. I think you're in Maine today. Thank you for taking time to speak with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So, obviously, people know you through the book Superpower and your work with regard to how to create a more effective electric grid in this country. But before we get into those large scale issues, I want to talk a little bit more about you and what appears to be your ability to pay close attention to the places where you are. You're obviously based in Houston, and you have done a lot to try to make Houston a more livable, vital, walkable, bikeable place. Tell me about how somebody can think both in 1,000 miles swaths of land, but also be concentrated at the neighborhood level. Tell me about your observations in Houston.
Um, so I sort of think that it's one of the keys to, I don't know, this is I'm going really deep really fast here, but uh, to a sort of happy life is to be connected to the place where you live.
Right.
And one really good way to get connected is to get involved. And I sort of, like a lot of people, I had sort of my head down for a couple of decades working in business and so on. As our kids got older and didn't, when they're teenagers, they don't really want to hang out with you, so you want to figure out other stuff to do. So I got deeply involved in a number of initiatives in Houston. One specifically called Bayou Creamways.
Hmm.
This idea had been around since the early 1900s of building trails and parks along the bayous of Houston. And so a bunch of us got together in the early 2010s and said, let's go do this. And we raised a bunch of money from the private sector and the public sector. And the vision was, let's connect all of Houston via these 7 or 8 bayous that sort of thread together and converge mostly around downtown. And here we are, 12 years later, and it's largely done. And we've got a couple hundred miles of bayou trails that are one of the great amenities in the city. And as you know, you got to work with what you got. In Houston, we don't have mountains or beaches, but we do have these bayous, and they connect things. And so it's been a lot of fun, and it's tied in nicely with my day job, which is working on other types of linear infrastructure.
Right.
Um,
But I
so
think you said if you're going to attract the talent to do what you want to do in your day job, so to speak, you need to have a place where people want to be. Why would I come to Houston? I think you talk about interviewing some people and say, well, I'm not sure if that's the place where I want to live, or I don't see what's happening just outside my door. And you've tried to create a better place. Our colleague, Bobby Tudor, who knows Houston and the energy sector well, has said something similar, that if Houston doesn't get its act together with regard to the things you're talking about, as well as moving towards renewable energy at the same time, can it maintain its place of innovation, which is held in the fossil fuel industry? Can it maintain it is as we move towards renewables? And part of that is making sure the city itself is attractive, that people want to be there and work for you and or others.
that is spot on. Bobby's a great spokesperson for that. Um, and it's not just, people, we think of this competition, which I think competition is a healthy thing, as a U.S. matter, but it's really not. I mean, the global leadership in energy innovation is a global competition, and we have to compete not with Denver, Minneapolis, San Francisco. We got to compete with London and Berlin and so on. So it is not it's not a small challenge, and so we got to do everything that we can.
Right.
I don't know that there will be one winner in this race, um, but to win or to do well in the race, we can't just rely on business. We also have to rely on trying to build a great city. So
Right.
that's our
So
challenge. And in Houston, we have extra challenges because we have, we're close to the Gulf of Mexico, which is heating up and weather's getting more extreme. And we got all that stuff as well.
Well, I was about to say that. One of your observations surely would be, as it was mine when I lived in New Orleans, is that Houston's quite vulnerable to extraordinary storms, and that includes the ship channel and a variety of other things. So, if you're interested, as you clearly have been, in the impacts of climate change, how to move away from some of the energy producing systems that we have, which are going to have to happen in the future, the vulnerability of Houston certainly has impacted and maybe brought a greater degree of urgency to your larger project, which is how to transition to a more electrified country.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So I just want to confirm that, because Houston's a singular place in that regard. If the wrong storm hits your city in the wrong place, everybody in the country, if not the planet, is going to feel the effects. One last thing, thinking about Houston, you've also been involved in the I-45 renovation, so to speak, or transition. The comparison between our willingness to fund the national highway system versus the national electric grid system, how do you reconcile that if you can? Because we seem so willing to spend more on highways and cars, maybe because we experience ourselves using it in a more visceral way. But the comparison between the two surely can't be lost on you.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I was involved in an effort. I guess I'm still involved to try to redirect TxDOT, our highway department's energies toward a freeway expansion that I thought would have made more sense if they'd made some changes to it. They largely ignored our suggestions. Then another group got involved called Stop I-45, and they um, were their view was like, Skelly, you're a naive fool. This isn't going to work. They're not going to listen. They were right about that part. They've been unsuccessful, and so TxDOT is going to spend, I think by the time it's all said and done, on the order of $20 billion. I think the budget is like 12-ish now, but as these
Yeah.
things go, um, on a very a huge expansion of a freeway, basically cheek to jowl with downtown.
Right.
Not my idea of how you would improve a city, um, but that's sort of the background there. Um, so the question is, why do we spend more money? I think it's because people experience in a very direct way
Right.
induced demand, which is the notion that if you build a freeway, they will come, particularly if it's free. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in Houston, we have this strange system where the freeways that are convenient and direct are free, and then the loop freeways are that are less convenient cost money. So it's no accident that the through traffic takes the free route
Mm.
and avoids the route that you have to pay money for.
Right.
So there's a lot of unforced errors in freeway planning, as there are in other types of infrastructure. But um, in highway departments have they're monopoly service providers run by fairly risk averse engineers and with predictable outcomes.
Right. And we have done a podcast with Megan Kimball on induced demand. You can keep widening highways, expressways, and you will fill them up because for all the reasons that you just mentioned. So it's an
Yeah.
inexact science with, as you also pointed out, tens of
Yeah, and
billions of dollars going to it.
it's kind of a crazy thing. So you're um, the I-10 corridor folks. So you'll notice that only in Texas, I think it's only in Texas along I-10, we have feeder roads. Okay,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and feeder roads are extremely dangerous because you merge 0 mile an hour traffic with 70 mile an hour traffic, and we build them 3 lanes wide, and they're hugely intensive in terms of land, in terms of like attracting all the commercial to next to the feeder road, where again you have this dangerous intersection. Like that one little change would make a world of difference.
Hmm.
in terms of land use impact, commercial development, et cetera, et cetera. But TxDOT is one of 4 or 5 states that does that.
Yep.
They know themselves that it's dangerous topic, but
Yeah. Yeah, and we probably shouldn't. I'm sure my producer Taylor is saying, "Are you all going to talk about the energy grid?" And so let's get to that. But I will know that
yes,
where the condition you just described as the worst is in the energy corridor in Katy on the 10. So there's a little bit of
yeah.
irony there. So your expertise and how people have come to know you is the result of your efforts to try to move renewable power where it's generated, for example, in Oklahoma, to the places where it's needed, which requires building transmission lines between those places and making those connections. And if we can do more of that, we could accelerate this transition that we all feel is necessary. And you've done that 1, 2, 3 times in your career with various companies that you've either worked with or started. And the book Superpower details that in a really extraordinary way. It seems that maybe your time has come. Talk to us about the federal agency's regulatory commission's recent order, which would
Yeah.
seem to
Okay.
suggest that on a national basis, we need to think about power transmission more holistically, more regionally, which is what you've been, if you will, battling your entire career. Have they come around to your way of thinking? And are you optimistic about the future as a result of this?
So let me just zoom way up for a second,
Great,
okay?
great.
So we have had these debates in the United States since the get go, okay? Um, since the even the late 1700s. We didn't even wait till the 1800s about what should we build, how do we build it, what should the role of government be, should the government be involved, should it not be involved, and those debates carried on to the canal boom, railroad boom, highways, et cetera, et cetera. And so these today's discussion around transmission, um, you can kind of hear the echoes of some of these previous debates. We have this thing called the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and their job is to look at energy, basically electric power and natural gas. That's where most of their power, and also hydropower, and say, all right, what should we do and what should we not do? So back historically, we had planned the grid on a hyper local basis. So a local, in Arizona, you'd have whatever the predecessor company to Arizona Public Service was probably a company based in Phoenix,
Mm-hmm.
and then they expanded, and then they became APS. And so we looked to each state entity to plan their grid. And then in the late 90s, we said, well, we should have these regional grids. So we came up with this thing called the Regional Transmission Organization or Independent System Operator. They're often used interchangeably. And FERC said, hey, you all should plan the grid on a regional basis because you'll get the efficiencies that we got when we went from planning city by city to planning state by state. And now, so we started planning it interregionally. And then as needs have evolved particularly over the last decade and a half, and we've been faced with this challenge of, okay, we've got these intermittent types of supply, solar and wind. One way to integrate more of that is to spread it out more. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Then we came up with the notion of interregional demands, because if you think about it, if you have a bunch of regions and they're all growing independently, okay, and those are all their own separate networks, what you'll find is the growth of those networks will create the opportunity to make fairly low cost, highly effective connections between those networks. This is kind of basic network theory stuff, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so FERC said, hey, you RTOs should work together and come up with not just better regional plans, okay, but interregional plans. And we tried that with FERC Order 1000. Not a lot happened. That was like 15 years ago. There's new efforts underway, actually at the congressional level, to tell the regional groups, hey, you really have to work together to get projects done. We'll see where all that goes. But the most recent FERC activity has been around reinforcing this notion of regional planning. okay,
Right.
and saying you have to plan for 20 years out. Believe it or not, we only plan the grid like years out. We ought to plan it for 30 years out, but the paradigm was, years out. And you got to think about demand growth, and you got to think about a bunch of other stuff that, one would assume that they were already thinking about, that they didn't always use those criteria. So good progress at FERC.
So progress at FERC. There's discussions about how Viking Link is connecting countries. So we're seeing examples of that happening around the world. And you probably saw Wallace Wells' report or opinion in the New York Times talking about solar being almost free. So the things that you've been interested in, solar, wind, alternative energy, seem to be coming around. But you mentioned Congress. It was surprising in the book, which I read again, A Superpower, that there's Congress and then there are individuals in Congress. You could run into some people who, for whatever reason, could say, I'm sorry, I just don't like wind. And I probably like something else, which is why I don't like wind, or I don't like something else you're proposing. What did you learn about, if you will, human nature within these large organizations and how powerful that can be? People's perception of the world and how they impose that on the rest of us in a certain way.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I drew any universal conclusions, but I will tell you um, that it is a real problem when you are developing a multi-billion-dollar interstate infrastructure project, and your project is the subject of of a vote on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Like that is
Yes.
not a good day. That is
Right.
not where you want to end up.
Right.
So that's where we ended up. Um, I think what we so this was you're referencing projects that we were working on back in the 2010s, which
I
are
am,
still.
and powerful senators, and or when you're talking about regions and how regions can be effective. Regions involve states and state boundaries and state legislatures and representatives and senators. It gets really complicated real fast, as you know.
Yeah. So I think it's not like we didn't know this. Like we always knew that what we were going to do or trying to do at Cleanline was going to be extraordinarily difficult. We knew that from the get go. We were right. It was difficult. I've subsequently started another company called Grid United, a
Hmm.
little bit of a different strategy, a little bit of a different focus. The timing is much better now. I mean,
Right.
12 years ago, we thought, hey, the grid really needs fixing. But we were the only people, maybe not the only people, but there weren't that many of us. And now I think there's a general realization that
Yeah.
we're using more power. It's coming from different places. We need a much more substantial grid. And so I think we're hitting it at the right time.
So let's talk about that. So it was Clean Lines, which the book really documents, and your efforts to make some things happen. Grid United is your current company. Describe a little more specifically why you feel more optimistic now and how you're approaching business differently.
Okay. So what in the last go round, we had a vote. We tried very hard to work with the incumbent utilities. Okay. Um, because in many ways they're sort of they have state relationships, they've
Mhm.
got they get things done, um, and they have a what you might call a regulatory compact with lots of stakeholders that helps them accomplish things. They weren't that interested, okay,
Hmm.
because they were sort of focused on, well, we've got the energy that we need. We're not seeing a lot of load growth. The generation mix that we've got is working fine for us. Today, it's very different. We're trying to accomplish several really big things at once. One is um, we are trying to meet load growth, and we're at load growth now of you know 3, 4, even 5%. Like in Arizona, we're at like 5% a year some years. We haven't seen this level of load growth since the 60s and 70s. Um, that requires more wires in the air. At the same time, we are trying to move toward a new fleet of generation sources. Okay.
Hmm.
So we're moving away from uh, old, like we have coal plants that are 60 years old and are at retirement age. So they're going to roll off, and we're going to build other plants take their place. And some of them be solar, some will be geothermal, some will be wind. We're introducing batteries. So there's all this stuff happening that changes the grid topology, which in many, many cases means that we need more wires in the air. At the same time, we continue to electrify the economy, either electric, heat pumps for heating and cooling, electric transportation, et cetera. And this is all happening in sort of fits and starts. But the trend line is fairly clear that in the next 30 or 40 years, we're going to need a lot more electricity, and it's going to be coming from different sources. Okay, and that will happen not in a straight line, but it sort of will kind of bump and grind our way toward that future.
Well,
So
that's interesting. What you just said right there. Is this the way? I'm sure you would say not exactly to build a national grid or a macro grid. And we have three major grids: Texas, East, and West. If you could step back and say, yeah, we're now getting more traction, we're making things happen in certain areas through Grid United. But if you could step one step further back, would you say, wait a minute, it's not just regions, we need to think nationally? How would you advise the federal government at this moment if you could execute something at that scale, the way we actually thought about the national highway system to some degree?
so first of all, I think there's this notion that the national highway system came about sort of um, in a less organic way than was actually the case. I mean,
That's true. That's true.
you've probably read the book The Big Roads,
Oh yeah.
um, which is sort of tells a story of these were like rabbit trails, and then Native American paths, and then trappers, and then pioneers, and then a wagon road, and so on. And then these same corridors evolved into what today are the interstate highways. So I don't think this is not France. It's not. We're not in Brazil or China. We're not going to come up with some national plan. It's just not how we roll. That's not
Hmm.
how we did it back in the early 1800s. And it's
Okay.
so the way we're going to change the grid in the U.S. is by kind of one project at a time, and it'll be less organized, and it'll be lumpier, and it'll go in fits and starts and so on. But that's kind of how we do things, and
Yeah.
we're not going to change that. I don't think.
Hmm.
So our job, if you will, as people trying to sort of push the envelope on what can get built and what can't get built, is to come up with um, big protagonistic projects that who would stand on their own merits. Okay, each individual project has to make sense on its own,
Hmm.
um, and those projects will help inform this evolving policy discussion. Okay,
Hmm. Hmm.
and we actually are feeling that now. The Southwest Power Pool, it wants to expand east and west, and so we're the projects that can help make that happen. And so they have to change some of the rules about how you connect to the grid and so on, and some of the market mechanisms to accommodate. Well, those changes are probably good for everybody,
Hmm.
but they're necessary because they weren't projects like ours weren't contemplated back when they wrote the rules and so on. So our job is to kind of put together these what we hope are winning projects, but at the same time, these projects will help inform all of these discussions about how we're going to build the grid that we need.
So it's leading by example and getting a project operationalized and demonstrating that this can work, which could change policy as opposed to going straight to the policy. You need to show that something can be done, it sounds like. And the interface between the public and private sector, I think you've said from the beginning, you believed it was possible to have a private sector business to do, if you will, the public's serve the public need. Describe that to some folks because it's interesting where we sometimes rely or expect government to do certain things, but you see a real role for the private sector to be this innovator.
I think that's who we look to today in the early part of the 21st century in the United States. We are looking to the private sector to come up with solutions.
Hmm.
Um, if this were 1934 and we had FDR in the White House, and
Right.
um, um, what's the guy's name? The folk singer.
Oh,
Um,
Woody Guthrie?
Woody Guthrie writing songs, roll Columbia roll, and
There you go.
building out the Bonneville Power Administration's hydro. Like that would be a different day, and
Yep.
we'd be talking about that. And in that life, hopefully, I would be mixed up in all that stuff. But I'd be working for Uncle Sam and not Grid United. Um, it's just kind of where we are, and that's what So it's we are looking to the good, bad, and different. That's the moment that we live in. We are
Right.
looking to private sector actors to figure this stuff out.
It requires capital markets to find that compelling. And I think it's been true throughout your career. The businesses you've started, worked with, you've got to convince others and where those resources are to buy into your vision. And sounds like you're having more and more success in that regard, given the demand, much of which we hear is the result of AI and other things that are putting stress on the grid and the production of power.
Yeah. Yes. Well, it's too early to declare success, but we're trying very hard and finding. I think we're working on the right projects at the right time, and
Right.
hopefully that will turn into successes.
Yeah. There was a moment in your career, which I think, if I read correctly, quoting your wife, this was almost inevitable. You ran for public office.
Yes.
Between one of your stints and one of your companies on your way to the potentially next one, but you looked around you, and given what I started this discussion with, your clear interest in the community in which you live, you have a real sense of that. And the polling suggested that someone who was involved in alternative fuels and the ideas that you were bringing to the fore, yeah, had a shot. And so you ran for office, I think it was 2008, if I'm not mistaken. Tell me if I'm wrong there, but
That's
about
correct.
that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Yeah.
About that time. Um, for someone in the private sector, but sees the need and maybe the role that someone can play in the public sector. I think you advised the Obama administration a little bit with regard to energy things. So you certainly knew government. You had to interface with government. What compelled you at the time? And I can't help but ask, as you look at the situation today, we've got an election coming up, which will have impacts both in Houston, Texas, and the country. What caused you at the time to jump into the possibility, and how would you look at such a possibility today?
Running for office is a uh, the product of drinking a concoction of like ambition and confidence and interest in service, and interest in sort of the policy issues of the day, and that's what kind of compelled me to run. Plus, in my case, as an immigrant to the U.S., I think the sense that you should do something, it can be even stronger.
Hmm.
In a way, I mean, people like there's lots of views on immigration, but I think many of the people who are most who feel most passionately about the American promise are people from other countries, and
Right.
so and that's obviously there's a selection bias going on there, because if we didn't think if my parents hadn't thought that, they wouldn't have moved here to begin with. But anyhow, that was probably a factor as well. But I no regrets. I mean, it was like I lost more badly than I would have hoped, um, but it was a fantastic experience in good measure because it gives you this license to go meet a lot of people and talk to a lot of people. And I tell you one thing about it is like you don't jump to conclusions about people after that. You meet
Hmm.
them and you find out where they're at, and everybody's got a story. Everybody's got something interesting going on. And one of the things I loved about it was that sort of hunting license to go learn all kinds of stuff from all kinds of different people. That was my favorite part of the whole campaign. My
Which
least
actually,
favorite part
go ahead.
was you have to talk about yourself constantly,
Hmm.
because that's what people legitimately want to know about you. I mean, you're asking for their vote. You should talk about yourself, but that's not. I don't know. That wasn't the funnest part of it.
However, a lot of people have described you as an optimist, and your ability to talk to people, which you had to do in your business to try to convince them to allow you to uh, install transmission lines across communities, across states. I mean, you're clearly very good at that, the greatest spokesman maybe out there for this kind of activity. So it would seem that that wove itself right into your ability to talk to people when running for election. So that doesn't surprise me that you would enjoy that. Sounds like you learn a lot from all of your conversations. So
Yeah.
where you and the wind industry and transmission finds itself today, um, sounds like you're feeling again optimistic about where things are going. I'm sure the focus on infrastructure in the past few years has been very helpful. But if you were to put on your optimist hat, where can we be in 5 or 10 years if things go according to plan in a positive way?
So I am I mean, look, by Nate, if you're going to be in the transmission business and you're working on projects that take a decade, um, you're by nature an optimist. So there's a self-selection that takes place there. Um, and I do think the zeitgeist is coming our way. I mean, I'm I'm a sort of fan of the abundance agenda that you hear emerging from the sort of center left, which historically has said, let's stop things. And now they're like
Hmm.
going, hey, let's go build things. I
Hmm.
think there's potential convergence with folks on the right who want to build stuff as well and who, want a, in the Trump administration, they called it energy dominance. Um,
Hmm.
and I think there's potential convergence there, and we sort of feel that as we're working in like North Dakota, Montana, and Arizona, New Mexico, and so on. So that gives me cause for optimism. And then I guess one thing I would add to some of the sort of the why of transmission. Um, and you mentioned wind, and that was sort of the prime motivator for the last go round at Cleanline. But the projects that we're working on today are largely grid to grid projects. So
Hmm.
reinforcing the grid, creating the ability to move power on a continental level. Um, and part of that is informed by a sense that, like, look, we really don't know where we're going to get our power in 30 years. Okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
But the really great thing about this moment is we are trying everything. We're trying new types of geothermal,
Hmm.
people working on fusion, fission, small modular nukes, more better wind, perovskite solar, like all kinds of stuff. Now, what do we know about these new sources of generation? We know they're all capital intensive. It costs a lot to build these things, but the operating costs are typically very low, and you want to run them flat out. Okay, so the ticket to
Hmm.
running them flat out is you got three choices when you make electricity. Okay, you either have to consume it instantly, you got to store it, or you got to move it to somewhere else where they can consume it. Okay,
Hmm.
so in that those are your only three choices. Okay, but with these high fixed cost, low variable cost generation sources, you got to do one of those three. So battery technology, lots of improvements there.
Hmm.
um, Consumption, we're getting smarter about how we use it and when to use it and so on. And then moving it, we got to be able to move electricity to where we need it, in order to take advantage of all these different resources that we have. So we don't, because we don't know exactly what the generation sources are, we got to make sure that we make all the no regrets investments today that we can. And I think, well, history tells us that when we invest in infrastructure, it typically does pay out. I mean, there's not that
Hmm.
many, particularly there's no wires that we don't use anymore. We're using all the wires that we've ever built. So I
Right.
think we can feel pretty good about these investments.
So, Michael, you're operating in our part of the country, where I'm in Phoenix now, in Arizona. Let's talk about the South Line that connects, if I'm not mistaken, El Paso and Tucson in this region. You want to talk about why that's a likely target for your work, why you're optimistic about how that can work?
Yeah. So I'm so glad you asked this question because it's so relevant to 10 across. So basically, what we're doing um, is we have we're working on a transmission line. We teamed up with some folks who've been working on it for a long time, um, and we're building a almost 200-mile line between South Central New Mexico and Tucson,
Hmm.
and the last 60 miles or so are upgrading of existing facilities, and the other is greenfield. From there, that's sort of phase one, and this project will move wind, solar, geothermal from South Central New Mexico to load centers in Tucson and Phoenix. It's phase one. Phase two, we're going to connect over to um, El Paso, okay, which is
Hmm.
also part of the Western electric grid. Phase three, we're gonna sort of upsize the line. um, you wouldn't be able to tell from looking at it, but we'll have one circuit which will be AC, and the other circuit will be a DC circuit, or that
Hmm.
we can build in the future, and that will allow for connections to the eastern grid in the future. Okay, so we're kind of over investing a little bit at the beginning to create the ability to connect to basically the Texas Panhandle and eastern New Mexico, and that will allow the exchange of power. Probably a lot of solar power, excess solar in the desert Southwest, with wind in the Southwest power pool. So in sort of eastern New Mexico and Texas, you have a lot of wind, especially at night, and in the desert Southwest, a lot of solar, obviously during the daytime, and that exchange of power will be very helpful to meet the needs of the future.
Does this require an independent thinker like yourself and Grid United to say, hey, why not? If you weren't coming to this conclusion and wanting to get this built, who would? Because it sounds like it's going to be very effective or can be very effective and efficient and useful into the future. It's just interesting that you are proposing this. How else would it come
Yeah.
about?
Well, if you talk to Arizona utilities, they are buying power from. There's some very small connections with Eastern Grid, and Arizona's taken maximum advantage of those, but it's like they're very very small connections, and
Mm,
and they're stations that were built like 50 years ago, so they break down and
mm,
so on. So it's not. Uh, but I guess to ask your question, like we do need sort of independent actors or independent players to do this, because if you're a New Mexico utility or a California utility, your governance and your
right,
regulator, they're state based. So we do need an independent protagonist to move this along. But it's not that these folks don't understand why this could be very helpful. Okay. But
right.
it's just not really in their mandate. Okay.
Yeah, right, right. Which let's conclude by actually maybe levering that uh, discussion a little bit. You have an awareness of what's going on in Houston, Texas, nationally. From your work in this area, power transmission, what do you think you've learned that's applicable to other things in other fields about what needs to be done to overcome some of the pitfalls that are in place because people behave the way they do? They think that's what their agencies, states, businesses require of them. From what you've learned, I'm sure you could offer a lot of thought to people in other fields and say, persistence and innovation is necessary. I'm demonstrating in my field what I think I've learned here might be applicable to something else. Is there anything that comes to mind given your broad perspective?
I think so. We are intensely focused on stakeholders. Okay.
Hmm.
And we've managed to capitalize the business so that the first thing that we do is we go talk to landowners as opposed to state agencies. Okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
That I think is applicable to lots of types of infrastructure. It's more money up front, but in a sort of at a time when the country's a little bit grumpy, I think this is sort of the only approach for large scale projects like this. The problem is you have to get the capital so that you can support a more upfront focused stakeholder outreach than might otherwise be the case. Now, I don't know if I'm not, again, we're not declaring victory, but the alternative seems too difficult, to be totally honest.
Hmm.
That's one. The other is we really do have to think about how do we build more stuff, more of the right stuff in this country. And I think it's so. I'm sort of have an obsession with, um, as we talked about earlier, with some of these urban issues,
Yep.
and we have to figure out how to make it possible to build more, particularly more housing. I mean,
Right.
we don't build housing, and we have a homeless crisis, and we wonder why. I mean, it's like it's
It's
so
so funny you
obvious.
brought that up. I mean, your mind, your way of thinking about things, talking to stakeholders, how to overcome issues, respond to capital markets, housing is that project. In
Yeah,
addition to what you're doing, it's so clearly in front of us, and we've got to find a way to innovate the way you have in your field. There's just no doubt about it.
yeah.
So,
But even in like Houston, where we're arguably at the we don't have zoning, but we have a lot of land use rules that make it more expensive to build than it ought to be. So
right,
anyhow, there's a lot we can do, and we got to get this stuff right because, uh, well, for competitive reasons, to take care of folks who don't have the resources that others of us have. We got to get this housing thing sorted out.
right. And there have been some innovations in housing in Houston that we have pointed to because there have been some successes with regard to homelessness and other issues, and we've pointed to Houston on multiple occasions, including at our summit in Los Angeles. So there's a lot we can learn from each other. Michael, I want to thank you very much for all of your time, your insights. We clearly share a lot of interests, and I hope we get to meet in person in Houston in the not too distant future, maybe in your firehouse.
That sounds great. Thank you very much.
All right, take care.